I'm Reverend Udell. I'm delighted you've chosen to listen to our program today, Struggles of the Spirit. We're talking about Buddhism today and how the Buddhist understands the human quest for God. Just saying it that way is not a Buddhist approach, but for purposes of our program, we'll start out that way. We have a guest with us this morning, Dr. Stephanie Kaza from the University of Vermont. She practices Buddhism herself. She's not just an academician. She's someone who tries to live her faith, and that has been a precondition, as far as I'm concerned, for our guests, that we want people who are living it and who understand it from that point of view. And so we're going to talk about the whole aspect of Buddhism. It's a huge topic, just as huge as Christianity, maybe even larger. And so we'll begin, I guess, by asking you to come on camera, Stephanie, and to begin however you like. But the leading off question is that how does a Buddhist understand the human quest for God, search for God?
Well, you're right, Lee, that this question is probably not the way most Buddhists would phrase it, but so I'll just take a little spin in a couple of different directions that might be interesting to listeners. One is thinking that this quest for God is a quest for meaning, for understanding, making sense of the world, which is alternately terrifying and awesome in its prospects when we fully open ourselves to it. Most of the time we stay somewhat protected in distance from those enormous aspects of it. But when you meet them, what a Christian or a Jew might be saying is meeting God. A Buddhist might be saying they're experiencing fully the vast interdependent web, and that this vast web of causes and conditions has so many aspects to it, so many elements. This causes that, and then that causes that, and then this from history affects this little seed that will be planted in the present. And when you catch a glimpse of that, it leaves you pretty speechless. And something actually changes, I think, internally in the way you perceive the world. So something about understanding and meaning might be one aspect of this quest. And the other, I would say, is the way we'd put it in the Buddhist terms would be a quest for enlightenment, or awakening.
I think that's a familiar term to us.
Yeah, a kind of sense of how can I understand the world with an awakened mind, assuming that much of the time we're asleep to this vast, complex mystery that's beyond our comprehension. So many of the Buddhist practices focus on cultivating and developing the possibility, the capacity for an awakened mind. And one maybe aims for enlightenment as some kind of a goal, but really it's in the moment-to-moment practice where you develop spiritual fitness, or as I've heard some people say, or spiritual capacity, thoughtfulness, compassion, various aspects to Buddhism that come up as you work on this path towards awakening.
Would the Buddhists then, in their desire for enlightenment, would that spring perhaps out of their hunger for something eternal, for something that has meaning beyond their own life, for something that they can rely upon, like a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim might?
Actually, this is one of the strongest contrasts between the monotheistic traditions and Buddhism. Some of the truths that are posited as eternal in Buddhism actually take the ground out from under you. One of these is that there is nothing which lasts forever.
Oh.
You see, there's absolutely nothing. All things are impermanent, whether it's, a mosquito, a human being, a mountain range, a solar system. That very impermanence is what all things hold in common. And an understanding of impermanence awakens a sense of compassion. because you can begin to see that all forms of life or creativity come and then they pass away. And it generates a kind of humility about one's own lifespan.
And how about, quote unquote, the deity? Is the deity transient?
Well, the deities, if there are any deities in Buddhism, are encouraging archetypes. I brought one here. I don't know if it's too small. On the camera, I'll hold it up.
Maybe they can zoom in on it.
Yeah, this is Kuan Yin. And I just have a small altar at home, so I don't have any large statues here. Kuan Yin is one of the bodhisattvas that helps you in your practice. Mm-hmm. And in this particular depiction, she's very soft and tender and has a beautiful face and countenance. Kuan Yin is seen as the bodhisattva that hears all cries of suffering. Now, this isn't really a god in the more traditional sense of the monotheistic religions. It's more like a realized being, someone who doesn't even really exist. And you couldn't go out and like shake hands with Kuan Yin. And yet she exists, or he exists, inside of everyone. So it's tapping a kind of potential for being ultimately compassionate around understanding all the various forms of suffering in the world. Now, there are a number of other bodhisattvas. Manjushri Bodhisattva is a realized being of wisdom who fully understands this truth of interdependence, of mutual causality. And there Jiso Bodhisattva, who cares for children and travelers. So you could call them gods, but they don't really reign over human behavior, or humans are not called in judgment against their standards. They're more inspirational and hopeful figures. So, and even they change form and time over time. The Kuan Yin that I just was holding up was a sort of Chinese version who became quite identified with the feminine in China, but earlier in Japan was more masculine, had different countenance in the way the sculptors, portrayed it, and has an entirely different form in Tibetan Buddhism. So even these are seen as impermanent too. And the Buddha really taught that the greatest thing you have to rely on is your own experience of the truth, your own deep knowledge. He said, don't just take these teachings from me like dogma. Try to open your mind, train your mind, be aware so that you can taste them yourself. And that's really that, and the fact that you rely on that all things are impermanent and have no independent self, that they're dependent on all other beings, are more to the core in Buddhism, a sense that what lasts is more these truths than any form that they would take.
Well, so a Buddhist wouldn't have a catechism or 10 commandments like or a Torah, the way Jewish scripture would be revered. They have I'm trying to remember some of their sacred scriptures.
The Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, Lotus Sutra. Well, the difference again is that the texts aren't delivered as God's word.
Okay.
They are not. They're very important in the traditions, but it's sometimes hard to know whose words they are. The earliest ones in the Pali Canon are purported to be Buddha's words, but of course they were never written down. They were for like 500 years. So who knows how much they changed from whatever the first person remembered and then passed on to the next person. I mean, they had conferences, to try and remember and put them down, but it's more the power of oral storytelling in those.
Oral tradition.
That comes through, and so there's a lot of parables and a lot of moral stories. And then the other sutras are just from different great Buddhist teachers, whether they're Japanese or Chinese or Indian, and there is no one text like the collection in the Bible.
There's no creed like the Apostles' Creed or Nicene.
No, they're just it's multiplied too many times, and Southeast Asian Buddhism will look a little bit different than the concepts that are emphasized, in Japanese or Chinese Buddhism, and different traditions will highlight the importance of one text over another. So in Japanese Zen, very often the Heart Sutra is chanted in Japanese or in English over and over. Whereas in Southeast Asia and Thailand, they made focus on the Metta Sutta, which is about loving kindness prayers. So it varies considerably.
Is the Bhagavad Gita more Hindu?
Yes, that's more a Hindu tradition. But within all of these, there's many moral so-called commandments or guidelines. Commandments might not be quite the right term. The one I often hear is precepts, or principles to live by, or to try to live by, with a kind of sense that no one really will do this perfectly. But if you try, if you aim to not steal, to not lie, to not kill, then your life will have the capacity for more generosity and more compassion and more kindness. So those precepts are seen as coming out of the fundamental truth of all beings being dependent on each other. So if you really think, I am dependent on that forest to generate oxygen to support my life, then you think, then maybe it wouldn't be so good for me to kill the beings that are supporting my life. Just as you wouldn't think to kill, the mailman coming to your door or something. So it can take a very broad sense of that, or not to steal from others who have less than you, or steal nutrients from the soil for the others living on that.
Well, would you say something about Gautama the Buddha? That might be helpful for our listeners, because it might tie it down a little bit.
Gautama Buddha, the original teacher that Buddhism is named after, started off with your usual childhood kind of story, although he was the son of in a more royal family, not of peasant birth. And his father really intended for him to take over the kingdom. It wasn't really a huge kingdom, but at least go on in the family business, so to speak. And the Buddha wasn't against that, but then as he grew older, he, in fact, there had been quite a prophecy when he was born to say, your son will either be a great king or a great teacher, a great monk. And his father really wasn't very interested in the monk side, so he did the best he could to keep the Buddha protected from all of the world's sufferings, thinking that way he would not be distracted. So this is a classic tale that's then told about how the Buddha learned about suffering. He sort of escaped on a few excursions with his head servant on horseback, and on each different one they saw someone who was sick, someone who was dying, someone who was suffering from old age. And it woke up in him a kind of quest. His quest for meaning was, what is the meaning of suffering? Why do people suffer? Because then he saw it everywhere. So he spent 6 years searching and searching, studying with yoga teachers and other ascetics who would try to starve themselves. And he tried all the different kinds of religious teachings that were going on right then.
This was in the context of Hinduism?
Yes, it was. So you do have the parallel of Jesus gaining his learnings against the context of what didn't work any longer for him in Judaism. So the Buddha was sort of at the point of starvation, and there are some skeletal sculptures of him that show all his ribs, ribs hanging out in his face, all gaunt, and you think he should just die. And he was too weak to even hardly sit anymore, and he was down taking a bath, and he kind of crawled up to a tree and more or less fainted. And he was sitting beside this tree, and a woman from the village had come to offer her bowl of rice milk to the tree as a protection offering, so the tree would continue to protect her. But she saw this weak man there and gave it to him instead, and he drank it and realized that how dependent he was on the gifts, of the universe. And he gradually grew stronger, and then vowed to sit for a week until he came to finally some understanding of this suffering. And that's often now why many Buddhist traditions have week-long periods of meditation to kind of commemorate that week-long period. And many great truths came to him at that point about the nature of suffering and interdependence and impermanence. And at the end of it, he really wondered, well, now what should I do? And he thought about just staying there. It was kind of an amazing event to just sit there in this very awake, aware stage where the stories say he saw his past lives, he saw all of the many beings around him supporting his life. It was a very luminous kind of state. But he did hear a kind of, there are different versions of this, but one version is that he heard a voice kind of calling him forth to say, even though you see that the world is so defiled and has so many problems and isn't the way you're feeling right now in your enlightened state, there are still others who would benefit from your teaching. So please come forward and just share them. And so he started to walk. I think of him as a walking Buddha, because he walked and walked and walked all over India, teaching to whoever wanted to listen, and sometimes they would gather in crowds of 1,000. And during the rainy season, they would stay put for a while and just have teachings, and then after that, they'd start walking again. So he taught way into his 80s. He was quite a long-living, strong teacher, and the images that we have even today of Buddhas, the sculptures and the statues, like the big Kamakura Buddha in Japan, I think represent the serenity that he achieved and wanted to offer to others.
The lotus position you see the Buddha in, that wasn't just something he dreamed up. That was native to Indians, wasn't it? I mean, that's what it was, the Mormon tradition of the way people would sit.
Meditating. Yes, it came from the yoga tradition. It's a posture in which you would hold your hands like in a certain mudra. This might be one with the thumbs touching, or with the palms open, and each signified a different version of energy receptivity. One of my favorite statues in Thailand, very tall, it's about 150 feet in Bangkok, has the Buddha standing in his have no fear posture, which is one hand up and one hand pointing down. And it's reminiscent of the posture when he was challenged during his week of deep meditation by Mara. All the poisons and all the greed and all the hatred sort of devils came to haunt him. And Mara cried, "What right do you have to, ask these deep questions?" And the Buddha reached down and touched the ground with his one hand and said, "The earth is my witness to this truth seeking." So the standing Buddha both connects him to the earth, and saying, "Have no fear," it's that a welcoming gesture of these teachings are available to all, and you can come and sit in this great compassionate field and gain awakening.
That's interesting. So did he, any special way he died?
Well, actually, I wish you could say it was more special, but in his spirit of compassionately receiving food from those who wanted to care for him. I mean, it was a Buddhist practice to go with your alms basket begging, and so the monks enacted their dependence on villagers, and every morning they go out for their alms realms and take whatever comes into the basket. So he apparently died from food poisoning of some kind. Now, whether somebody deliberately poisoned him, that doesn't seem to come through in the stories, but and even the translation is arguable. It is either translated as a piece of pork, which might have been too old or carrying some bacteria disease or something, or a mushroom, which again might have been the wrong kind and poison. So it seems that it was probably an error, and he understood what was happening, and he was already old, so he died very peacefully, really. And there's some beautiful paintings of that death where all his disciples are, and many people, all the animals are all gathered around. And in fact, another posture of the Buddha that's often sculpted is the reclining Buddha. The Buddha, not necessarily at his death exactly, but at rest, kind of lying down posture. Saying that even at rest, even in sleep, one can maintain an awakened mind.
Would you, from the Christian or Jewish point of view, or would you say he was, these categories don't fit, but is sin a category in Buddhism? Would you say Buddha was without sin? Was he perfect, or that just irrelevant for a Buddhist, that term?
Well, I don't think we can dismiss it quite that easily, because the human capacity to err is pretty widespread, I mean, we make mistakes constantly, and some of them are worse than others. And I think, so you have small sins and you have big sins, and some really big mistakes are harming someone with your anger, or lying to someone, really not saying what's really going on. So the Buddha admitted throughout his whole life that he was as fallible and vulnerable as anyone to erring. He did not proclaim to be perfect. And there, I'm sure, are stories of his failings here and there, but he wanted to model himself as a human teacher, that he came in human form, that would die, but that one could die at least being aware of errors and then having the capacity to see them before you make them. And try and be aware enough that you're observing your behaviors and making choice and being careful along the way to these precepts. So, but to the concept of sin, what I've heard some Buddhist teachers talk about is that sin would be breaking the precepts deliberately, not so much accidentally, because we do things sometimes without knowing. You certainly kill many bacteria when you cook.
That's right.
Or you, or by inhaling them, into. So there's a lot of things you can't be entirely responsible for. But if you deliberately engage in some kind of sexual abuse or power abuse, then you should know what you're doing. And that kind of breaking the precepts is, you could call a sin, that you will generate bad karma. Okay. And what the Buddhists mean by karma is there will be repercussions on that web of causal links. You do something that harms someone else, and the repercussions will come back to haunt you in some way, maybe very quickly, maybe over many lifetimes, but the action doesn't go unnoticed.
Yeah, I'm not a scientist, but I vaguely remember hearing from the scientific point of view something called the butterfly effect, that even if a child throws a teddy bear out of its crib, that affects the universe. No, I'm not talking spiritually now. We're talking about how different bodies on the earth and in the whole universe are all interacting with each other. You mean it in that sense, perhaps.
Well, you can think immediately. There's the teddy bear's on the floor, and then that causes someone else, probably a parent, to pick it up, or to trip, or to respond in some way. So it does generate an action. Or maybe if the parent is really short-tempered that day, it causes them to yell at this child for throwing the teddy bear out one more time.
John Donne, the poet, said, the well-known quote, "No man, no person is an island unto themselves." And the same kind of thing, I suppose.
Well, you could say that in Buddhism that would be the greatest sin. The greatest sin would be to be so self-absorbed, to think that yourself was the center of the universe, and that you could do anything and it wouldn't affect anyone else. Sometimes teenagers go through phases like this. Yes. Well, but we all do. I don't want to just pick on them. And that's the kind of...
We're more sophisticated after we get out of it.
Right. We learn more mechanisms of denial. A lot of substance abuse is denial. And workaholism. There's lots of ways we protect ourselves and then think that our little list of things to do, is the most important. So the kind of, snap of awakening that a Buddhist teacher would give to someone in that state would be, remember, you're not the only one in the universe, and your actions affect others. So that's it's a very powerful spiritual teaching, because if you then realize my choice, if I choose to meditate, or if I choose to offer loving kindness prayers, or if I choose to burn incense for someone who has died, each of those actions goes out to support the people that you've directed your energy towards. And some of the Buddhist meditations are actually quite powerful, almost you could say technologies, for transferring energy from a living person who's very vital to someone who's sick or dying or in trouble in some way, or someone who is tempted, say, to lie or use drugs. And you can, physically, through doing these meditations, help them have the strength and stability to say no to something that would generate more harm for them.
Now, the Buddhist tries to, the goal is to be free of being reborn again and again and again through reincarnation, and to instead somehow, again, this is not a Buddhist term, but be with God. How would you phrase that or describe that effort?
Well, there are several major Buddhist traditions, as I mentioned before, coming from the different countries.
Sure.
And the tradition of trying to so-called get off the wheel of suffering, the wheel of life and death, is from Southeast Asian Buddhism. Now, in this tradition, you purify your karma each time you're reborn. If you're making a spiritual effort, you see, oh, that happened to me, and I still have this tendency, or I'm still impatient, or I still have greed, so let me work on that. And then if I gain enough merit, the next time I'm reborn, maybe I won't be burdened with that same difficulty. So there's a lot of what shall we say, psychological encouragement to be a good person in your life, so you won't be reborn and have a worse life afterwards.
Right.
Now, the different traditions emphasize rebirth and reincarnation to varying degrees. The arena that I practice in, Soto Zen Buddhism, puts more of the focus on the here and now. Right now, how are you living your life? Right now, how can you be more compassionate and more insightful and have a freer mind to be aware of others? And the goal is not so much something, in the future sometime. In fact, you know you're going to die, so it's almost as much as anything preparing for that death, so that at death you will feel comfortable with the life you led, not carrying tremendous regret or sorrow or anxiety about actions. So that tradition is much less goal-oriented. And in fact, all the Mahayana traditions of China, Japan, that kind of evolved from India and Southeast Asia, de-emphasize the attaining of arhatship, of this position where you're off the wheel, because it's too lofty and too far away of a goal, and maybe is just too unrealistic for most human beings. So instead they emphasize the bodhisattva goal, which is that as you attain greater and greater awareness and enlightenment, you are you pledge your spiritual efforts to serve others, so that your life never really is over. And the greater spiritual capacity you have, the more challenging situations you can take on and offer assistance in, recognizing again this interdependence, that no one will ever be free until all beings are free. So you take the bodhisattva pledge. In English, the way we say it is, let's see, well, the last line is, may I serve all beings, may all sentient beings be free. And so you keep returning to that actions over and over of service and of kindness. And there's no real end to that, as you can imagine, since so much misery and suffering everywhere. So it's a different orientation.
It's interesting thinking of comparative religion here. There's some Christians who would see, heaven as a place of eternal rest.
Right.
But that's pretty boring.
Right. Yeah, Buddhists would say that's just a delusion. There's no place really like that, And if you get to a place you think is all blissful, you're going to crash really soon.
Yeah. Now there are some traditions in Buddhism, aren't there, that some type of Buddha becomes reincarnate every 100 years or so to lead humanity. Is that from Buddhism? Or is that more Hinduism?
Well, maybe you're referring to the Dalai Lamas and the other lamas that are reincarnated in the Tibetan tradition.
I wasn't thinking of that.
The other I'm not so familiar with.
Maybe if this is Hinduism.
Because there's not so much of a time frame of, someone new will reappear at a certain point. The Tibetan tradition is the strongest for a sense of searching for the Buddha in anyone, because it could in fact be an incarnate Lama, and their tracking of that is absolutely astonishing.
I remember reading about how they chose the present incumbent, who is the Dalai Lama, and how they, well, you probably know the story better than I do, but they presented certain things to him that only if he could understand what they were,
right.
Which most of us certainly wouldn't.
Yeah.
It revealed who he really was. You want to say something about that?
It does seem remarkable. This little boy who's 3 or 4, monks would, come to the door. They find these people through visions, through kind of tuning their clarity and awakened mind to the nature of the spirit of the deceased Lama, and thinking how, sort of sending out energetic, I guess, kind of arrows or something of where is this spirit on the landscape somewhere, and they might get a vision of a village house that has a door that's this color or something, and enough cues that then they'll send expeditions out and go to that house, and then they show these things to this boy. And once they feel it's absolutely verified that this child is carrying some kind of incarnate wisdom and knowledge, by training him further, then that he can be a very fast learner, because these things he's already been exposed to them in the past, and he can go through all the stages of Buddhist training in the Tibetan practice, attain what's their equivalent of a PhD, and then be able to teach, or go on, maybe some of them go on to medical studies, which you can't become a Tibetan doctor unless you've gone through the full Buddhist training.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so medical training.
That's different than in the West.
It's quite different, and medical healing is seen as one part of spiritual healing. And the Tibetan doctor will use spiritual practices to heal, like chanting or visualizations, as well as medicines, herbal medicines. So it is quite different. But finding these young boys, it's been told in some of these Western movies now too, how they do it, and to us it just seems amazing, and to them it just seems traditional. So that's the most developed, definitely, in Tibet. I don't know of anything similar in Japan or China right now. So some different pieces. I did bring a couple things I could show here.
Okay.
We have maybe some callers. I see the phone numbers on the screen. In the Japanese tradition, when you decide to take vows, so to speak, as a Buddhist, not priest vows, but a layperson's kind of vows, you sew what's called a rakasu. It's kind of a bib, you can see. I put it on, it sort of hangs over me like this, and there's a lot of little stitches in it. And on the back of it is some Japanese calligraphy, which is a little message of encouragement from my teacher, and a Japanese name that he's given me also for encouragement. And the various panels in this are representative, it's just symbolic of the Buddha's robe. And the Buddha wanted to live extremely simply, and so they, gave up all their clothing, and they went to actually the funeral pyres of people who were to be burned and who were casting off the rags of their clothing, and they picked up ragged bits of cloth and they sewed them into panels. And so there's a classic form of 5 panels, each having one long and one short. And the priests have big, long, things they wrap around themselves. But if you've just taken lay vows to say, I will practice these precepts, then you wear one of these rakasus.
Would you wear that all the time, or just when you're in prayer?
Just usually in service or in meditation or in the meditation hall, because otherwise it's too conspicuous, really. It's a kind of mark you don't need to parade around and say, I'm a Buddhist,
Well, the Jew layperson has a prayer shawl. It's
yes.
Not just rabbis.
It's true, and I think it's maybe just a kind of modesty in America per se. Buddhism in America is still very new, and people sometimes think that it's a cult kind of following who don't know that it's a long-standing world religion. So I think it just feels easier to me to only wear this in the company of people who understand and are practicing.
I should interrupt you just for a minute and just welcome people to phone in to us. It is time, as you noticed, the number is on the screen to call us. And so we really are going to be delighted if you would phone in and join us here. You don't have to have just a question. You can just converse with us through our speakerphone as though you were present. And we would like that very much, because we do this for our viewers, not just for our own enjoyment of talking about these subjects, but for you people, it's a special opportunity. So please call and interrupt us. We will continue to talk, but please call.
Well, I might mention something, since I just talked about American Buddhism, about how that's taking shape in this country.
Yes, and why is it, at least from my point of view, growing rapidly?
Well, it's kind of fascinating. I started practicing about 20 years ago myself, and was very much drawn to new Buddhist forms of arts, of music and dance and theater. And the way people were doing this was to try and take their ego out of it. You know, most people that are in performing arts need to have a huge ego to communicate. And I thought, this is really interesting. It's a whole different way of doing arts. And I was raised in a musical family, so that kind of caught my attention. But also, various writers have picked people like Gary Snyder, of course all the Beats, Jack Kerouac and the Dharma Bums. A lot of literature was going into the culture in the 50s and 60s that was referring to Buddhism, even though people didn't know much about it. Now I think what's happened, as teachers have come to this country and have been training people, a number of American teachers teaching now, and actually probably every tradition of the world is here in America right now. And they emphasize the different teachings from their traditions. We're beginning to get to the point of letting go of some of the baggage that comes from the culture of the country that the religion came from. So, for example, in these Japanese traditions, many temples are not chanting the sutras in Japanese anymore, but translated to English. Although you can still, each one bears the mark of its tradition. But here in America, there have been three very interesting developments that are quite distinct from anywhere else in the world. One is, as Buddhism has arrived in America, it met psychology, Western psychology, the science of the mind, which is highly developed. And Buddhism has a very highly developed science of the mind, too. So there have been many Buddhism and psychology conferences. One of the leading teachers of Vipassana tradition, Jack Kornfield, is a psychotherapist, and some of his other teachers are, too. Really trying to understand the very complex psychological suffering that Americans carry that seems distinct from maybe some of the other cultures because of our great emphasis on individualism, complexes from family life, from work, and so on. So that's been a very interesting meeting, psychology. A second one has been the feminist movement, the women's movement. So as Buddhism came to America, women who were interested in practicing meditation began to challenge some of the more patriarchal traditions and forms of the parent countries. So some of these countries, for example, emphasized priesthood for men much more than for women. But that's just gone by the wayside in this country in many of the traditions, because the women are in a culture where women have been fighting for more options in general. So now there's women's retreats, women's Buddhist retreats, which has now spawned men's Buddhist retreats, which each have their own kind of character. Women's writings have been like dug up and put forth from Buddhism. So it's quite similar to what's happening in Christianity and Judaism, actually, around women's interests. And the third thing that I think is quite different and is also now influencing Buddhism outside of America is meeting with the environmental movement. So many people in the environmental movement were in some way disenfranchised or felt that the Judeo-Christian tradition didn't work for them. I think because they saw some of the really negative consequences of Christian missionizing on the landscape and with the Native American traditions, and some of the affiliation with capitalism in terms of doing good works, which meant more bad works for the environment. So a number of people have been interested in Buddhism as a different way to spiritually view the world, and thinking, well, maybe that works better for me. Now that's all very new and hasn't really developed in great depth. Gary Snyder's one who's written quite a bit about it, and Joanna Macy and some others. And I think it's because of the connection with ecological truths, that if the center of ecology is interdependence, and that's taught over and over again from an environmental perspective, that fits right in with the Buddhist perspective.
Yeah, from my perspective, the Jewish-Christian perspective about the environment has it's been somewhat a mixed message. In Genesis, we talk about that God said you were to have dominion on them, meaning that they're yours to do with as you see fit. He doesn't say that, but that's somehow the implication. then later on in the New Testament, we have talk about stewardship, and that,
Yes.
and that it's not your vineyard, it's somebody else's vineyard, and we're only here for a while, and we're supposed to tend it and look after it, and that's a different concept than have dominion.
Yes, it's growing in terrific popularity. I don't know if you've discussed this on some of your other shows, but I just came back from a conference in Seattle, put on by Seattle University, which is a Jesuit university, on the greening of liturgy. And it was very inspiring what the students there had done, drawing from sacred texts and communicating some of the stewardship message, and many people speaking about the need for the churches to participate in earthkeeping. And the stewardship message is the one that's coming through very strongly. There are, educational packets. There are guide frames for ministers and priests. There's national organizations, the National Coalition on Religion and Ecology, National Religious Partnership for the Environment. There's a strong evangelical movement right now of how to green that denomination. They've taken strong stands on the Endangered Species Act. So just in the last 5 years, the whole religion and ecology dialogue and conversation has just exploded, really. Buddhism's a little piece of it in America. The much bigger piece is in the Jewish and Christian traditions. So I find it very exciting, and it's a wonderful way to me, as an environmental person, to have interfaith conversations and dialogues and services, and really, this is common ground. We can share. We can, talk.
Only one earth.
That's right, and we don't need to use our religions to separate from each other. We can use it to care.
I think the Native Americans have the most to contribute, from my point of view, about the earth and its caring for it. But we have not really willingly sat at their feet to learn ever that I know of, but which is terrible.
It's a big loss, and to the extent they can retain some of the traditions in as traditional a form as possible right now, maybe someday we will be able to gain more from that. There is a kind of, what's the word I want, interest in understanding their spiritual teachings, but there is a lot of controversy around whether it's really okay for people from another culture, white culture, to come and just take the spirituality part without really dealing with the realities of these tribes, which are tremendous poverty, tremendous alcoholism and diabetes, unemployment, and a lot of suffering. So there's some resentment coming through, and I think the message is, if you want to learn about Native Americans, come and be with us and see where we are now and how it's a result of what's happened, here, of being
Western civilization and Western religions.
And colonization and a kind of apartheid. We have our own ghettos on the land here in North America that, and very often these areas are places that are subject to environmental racism, and that's the uranium waste dumps or coal mining, and so it's sort of compounding the errors and the insults and the cruelties. So there's a lot of work religions could do to make big scale amends environmentally, and I think maybe Buddhists can contribute to that in some way, but it will take everyone working together, I think, very much. So.
We are waiting calls, please.
Is that our number, 658-5165?
Right. Please call.
I'd love
call
to hear
in.
from you.
We would like to hear your thoughts. All of you have had some experience with Buddhism, some notions, some ideas, and I've found over the years that, particularly in the past, that many Westerners have had, from my understanding, not an accurate picture of Buddhism at all, but sort of as a way to escape this evil world and to try to become nothing. Just like a drop of water in the vast oceans of this earth, for us to ultimately escape this world and be a drop of water, you might say, in the universe. And you want to speak to that that myth?
Yeah, it's a good one to address. What goes along with that is a kind of nihilistic sense of this concept of emptiness. You know, I'm nothing, I'm nothing. And
yes, that's supposedly what Buddhism is about.
Yes, about emptiness, and then it's people have said to me, oh, it's such a pessimistic religion. All you talk about is suffering. Well, so let me talk about a couple of those things. The sense of emptiness, what that word really refers to, it's a kind of flip side of the truth of interdependence, that your self is made up of all these other causes and conditions that support your life. So the idea of an independent self is empty. It doesn't make sense. There's nothing there, really. But when I think I'm made up of the sun's rays coming down on me, of the rain that's watering the soil, of my family, you know, loving and hugging me, of, you know, the house that I live in. When you start laying out all the pieces of it, then you realize that somebody called Stephanie Kaza is a kind of an empty concept just by itself. But once in an interdependent sense, I'm very full and rich of all these. So it means empty of a separate self. That's what that phrase really means. Now, as far as the suffering, the pessimistic part, actually I have found Zen Buddhists to have an incredible senses of humor and a kind of spontaneous joy, because there's a sense, well, it's all impermanent anyway, so let's be fully here right now. And sometimes the moment is really quite a big joke, you know. So that suffering, really, the Four Noble Truths about suffering, you have to get all four of them or you kind of miss the point, because the first one is there's suffering everywhere.
Sure.
That people suffer, plants and animals suffer, and that you can't like live a life without suffering through your birth, suffering through your death, and so on. But then the second truth is that suffering is mostly caused by attaching to the state that you're in right then.
Yeah, that's again where people misunderstand.
Right.
That.
You think, I'm happy now, I'd really like to keep being happy, or I'm really sad now, and then you start feeling sorry for yourself, and you really get stuck, you know, in that, you know, self-pity. So then the third noble truth is there's a way out. One can be liberated from this suffering. Doesn't mean you won't have pain or you won't die, but it means by learning not to attach to it as something happening to this particular self in a detrimental way, with shining this kind of light of awareness on it, you go through the pain, you can go through the suffering, and it doesn't stick in the same way. And then the fourth noble truth is really a kind of prescription, eightfold path, and you can look at all the different ways that you can cultivate this kind of freedom or liberation. So the most enlightened person would be the one who's able to be the freest around various forms of suffering.
T.S. Eliot, in one of his 4 quartets, has the term "the still point of the turning world."
That's good.
That's where we all should be. That's from within at least his Christian perspective. But I think the average person doesn't understand that.
It takes practice. It's very difficult. You know, when you're driving fast in a car, when you have a lot of demands on you, the phone's ringing, there's, you know, things just keep coming, and you don't have control over all these things. Sometimes a lot comes at you, and it's very hard to keep at that place. But to continually practice on behalf of others at least helps keep you from being too absorbed, you know, with your own suffering. So there's an endless, you know, work one can do in gaining this kind of liberation. I wanted to mention that the medical world, which you're familiar with, has picked up some of these Buddhist teachings as mechanisms for pain control and stress relief. John Kabat-Zinn is one of the leading authors in this domain, although there are others as well, who have taken some of the mindfulness practices of Buddhism, of, you know, paying attention to thoughts and paying attention to sensations, to help people struggling with, say, arthritis or cancer, to manage their pain in a way that's actually quite livable.
Is this partly visualization?
Sometimes it's that, you know, trying to understand where the nerve system's moving. Sometimes it's slowing down the impulses, so you're not making them worse by clenching around them. Sometimes it's using helpers like a meditation bell, so you could
It's a lovely bell.
let the beautiful sound of the bell relax the mind and relax the body, so that very often much of what people suffer from when they're ill is the mental suffering that goes on top of the pain in the wrist or the hip or something. So by being able to differentiate between those two, it can be more comfortable for someone. They can be relieved of the anxiety or relieved of fears around their death and all the compounding pain, and just be present with, well, I have Parkinson's, and I have a friend who uses mindfulness practice very much when the shakes come on, to just calm them a little or make his way through a round and then return. And so that's one way Buddhism is also moving in the world without being called Buddhism, but taking some of the strengths of it.
Is there a heaven for a Buddhist?
No, I don't think so. Not that I know of.
What is there, if you have achieved enlightenment, what happens, quote unquote, to you?
Well, see, since you never really existed in the quote-unquote way, you were empty of that anyway, that all those elements just, in a way, dissolve and go on to support other lives. Now, I should say that in some traditions, like the Tibetan tradition, there's the kingdom of Shambhala. It's not so much a place that people go to, but a place one could hold in their mind as a perfection of existence. So it's a kind of utopian vision. And some people have seen these sand painting mandalas that Tibetan monks do. There was one downtown in Burlington here for a while. And those represent a kind of very clarified energetic state in which there's fewer and fewer defilements. So you could do a visualization of this sand painting mandala in your mind and try to live by the beauty and clarity of that. And so it's a kind of contained internally sort of heaven.
When I asked you to be on this program, I talked with you a little bit about Zen Buddhism, although I'm not a Zen Buddhist yet. I did read a good bit in it, and I was very interested in it, and still am. And the way I understood Zen Buddhism, and I'm asking you for education here, what I understood Zen Buddhism, like with archery, if you really practice Zen Buddhism, when you don't pull the bow back, you don't let the arrow fly, you don't aim, you participate in the event of, I guess, arrow flying to the target, and the goal, quote unquote, then in that kind of Zen Buddhism would be to be one with the whole process, not separate, and to try to get away from black, white, Greek, Roman, black, white, Asian, Western, that all kinds of discriminations ultimately get in the way of, you should live life as a flowing brook, as the water trickles down the mountainside. And that appealed to me.
Yeah, it's that lovely book, Zen and the Art of Archery, was one of the first inspirations to me, too, because I thought, yeah, how do you do that? But when I saw it, actually my Zen teacher is quite a good archer, and so I got to see him do this. It was one of the skills that he worked with around this teaching. And it is remarkable, and I understand now what it means is to have such an open flowing consciousness that at the time you're pulling a bow, you understand the nature of the bow, of the string, of the arrow, of the nature of all the things, of the ground you're standing on, of any people that are nearby, of the setting, of the state of your mind. You're somehow taking all of that into account. When you freeze up is when you think, oh, I'm making a mistake, or my hand's in the wrong position, or which are all little ego words. And the ego, much of Zen practice is to just get rid of that ego, or at least be aware of the ego, because it keeps tripping you up. That sense of, oh, it's my little separate tight self that's going to ruin this arrow flying. So to be in a kind of almost suspended state, no judging, no voice, getting in the way, and that takes tremendous practice in meditation and in other forms to really settle the mind, so it's not continually interrupting that flow of oneness. I can say I've had tastes of that experience, but it's not something I would say I can walk around all the time in that capacity. That would be the really enlightened master.
That's what the goal would be, if you want to use that
Right.
word, goal.
Yeah, a long time ago, I decided that I wasn't probably going to have a sudden enlightenment experience. They talk about where, one day nothing makes sense, and the next day it all comes true. So I've settled on the gradual approach, which has been talked about in the sutras. And I figure, you can be, maybe you're 10% enlightened, and then maybe a couple years later, after a lot of practice, you're 20% enlightened. And it means that more and more of your actions are flowing and taking account of all beings around you. And you still mess up, you still make mistakes, and there's still things you don't know about, but over time, you hope, I guess, that you become more and more able to be compassionate and generous in more and more challenging situations. And I have seen personally that the more you seem to master, the more challenges are delivered to you. And I think that's the spiritual path. Once you're on it, you can expect that that's the way it'll go for you. Yeah. In that sense, it's probably not really so different than other traditions.
I think the other traditions have that same experience.
Yeah. And the greater the teacher, the harder the questions.
I was intrigued in the book called The Asian Journal.
I think we have a couple more minutes here.
About 2 more maybe. Thomas Merton was talking with the Dalai Lama, and Thomas Merton being a very well-known, now deceased Roman Catholic spiritual leader, and both of them agreed that at heart, at the deepest level, the Dalai Lama and the Christian saint know the same experience.
I really would confirm that, and not that I have tremendous experience with this, but I've enjoyed a couple of Buddhist Christian conferences that I've attended in which people raise questions about this. They're continuing that same dialogue. We're very inspired by Thomas Merton and his encounters with Buddhism, and so because the forms are so different and the traditions are so different, there's been a tremendous kind of cross-fertilization and appreciation for different ways to the same end.
At this point, could you sum up? Because I don't want us to be off the air without you having a chance to however you want to sum up.
Well, Buddhism is a vast tradition with many texts, many teachers, and many denominations and sects. So I think if there's one thing I'd like to communicate, it's that of the forms that I've talked about today are really kind of general overviews. And the best way to really taste Buddhism is to experience for yourself. And I'd certainly invite people to go to the Buddhist centers. There's one in Shelburne that's a Zen teaching center affiliated with Rochester. There's also a Shambhala center, a Tibetan Buddhist center, and another Zen tradition that meets at the Unitarian Church regularly. So if you're curious, to go and talk with people who are trying to find their way through this practice now. And of course, there's many fine books out. We kind of call that nightstand Buddhism, to explore and get a little taste of too, and see if there's something in there that makes your life a little more relaxed and a little kinder and more compassionate.
Well, that's a good way to put it together, I think.
Yeah, that's what we are probably all struggling to do, and lead a life that... I
think our time is about up, so I really thank you for coming and being here today, Stephanie. Really, it's been a pleasure. I find the time too short. I wish we had more time.
Well, I wish you the best with the rest of the series, and I hope it's very inspiring and useful for others to really consider the role of spirituality in their own lives, of whatever form.
Well, there's a Christian saying, you have to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And I think we all do in all religious traditions.
That's true. It's a big job. So thank you very much for having me here, and good luck with the next round.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.